Greetings and salutations, friends, and welcome to Part 3, and don't worry, this will be the last one, of Why Is There Melee in 40k? This one will be even reasonably short, at least by my standards at the very least, even by some other people's standards, I might actually think. The third and final reason why there is melee in 40k is two reasons: psychology and circumstance. Now, this is one of those things that we all know, yet we often kind of overlook when it comes to discussions of games, etc. Because, we're playing first-person shooters and strategy games, and our view on this, and specifically if you're playing tabletop, for example, we don't really think about this, really. And that's the good old-fashioned fact that if a dude that is 3 times your size is charging at you with a chain sword, and all of your shots are bouncing harmlessly off his armor, you're probably gonna be a little bit scared, oddly enough. Now, there is actually a term for this that was coined in the Horus Heresy books, namely post-human dread. This essentially describes the fact that when a Space Marine is charging someone, well, first and foremost, the Space Marine is larger than any normal human. He is wider, he is far bulkier, he is taller, he is tougher, and he is completely enclosed in armor. If an standard Imperial Guard infantryman holds his ground and fires his las rifle at said Space Marine, the shots are going to be spanking harmlessly off his armor, doing little more than scorching his paint. And here's the thing: you could place a very accurate las blast to the helmet of the charging Space Marine, and you might penetrate. Best case scenario, you'll actually penetrate the helmet and do some damage to the Marine beneath. Or maybe you'll hit one of the lenses and do damage like that. Or, alternatively, you could shoot at his legs and try and knock him off balance. There are many ways to stop a charging Space Marine, but pretty much all of them depends entirely upon being able to stay perfectly calm and aim perfectly. And that's not easy. Even in our history, where we're just fighting normal humans, aiming well under pressure is hard. It is one of those skills that only veteran soldiers truly possess. You can train a man to, ignore distractions and shoot the same way regardless of the pressure he is in, but unless you're a very special human being, once the shells start flying around your head, you're probably going to be more preoccupied with keeping your head attached to your shoulders than firing accurately. And even if you would like to fire accurately, again, all of the stuff the human body does. Adrenaline, heart rate pumping, your hands are shaking, all of these things are affecting you. And this is one of the primary advantages of the Space Marine, the simple fact that they cause this fear effect. The thing is, a Space Marine is relatively vulnerable when it comes to massed enemy fire. He's got the armor to stand up to a fair bit of it, but if a squad of 20 guardsmen all just stop, aim, and continuously put automatic fire into a charging Space Marine, the odds are not terrible that they're going to put him down. However, the thing is, a charging Space Marine is very, very fast, which adds to the post-human dread. The simple fact that your mind is shocked that something so big, so deadly, so heavily armored could be this fast, and he's coming towards you, which naturally is going to send most people into a bit of a panic. Your brain is going to start running all over the place. How do I deal with this? Should I run? Should I stand my ground? If I run, what will happen to my comrades around me? What if I'm the only one running? What if all of them run? What if I'm left alone? Etc., etc. And it paralyzes you. Now, this is not, of course, only a thing about Space Marines. Space Marines use this to gain an advantage over unaugmented troops, but many races of the 41st millennium use it as well as a psychological advantage. For example, the Eldar, with their screaming banshees and striking scorpions. Other races use it without really meaning to, or well, you could argue that they do. The Tyranids, for example. The Tyranids are a perfect example because they have developed themselves to take full effect of the psychological effect of a mass of charging, creepy-ass dudes. The simple fact is, a single Gaunt poses very little threat to a single guardsman. He can pick him off at range without too much of an issue. A massive charging wave of Gaunts? Scary. And again, we can see plenty of examples of this in our own world. Mass infantry charges didn't really lose their effect until the time of the machine guns in the early 1900s. It wasn't until the literal introduction of weapons capable of killing hundreds of troops in very brief amounts of time that massed infantry charges started losing some of their effect. And the thing is, even back in the Middle Ages, or even in the 1800s, etc., a disciplined line of archers or musketmen could break pretty much any charge. The English demonstrated this quite handily at Agincourt, although of course they were helped out by some hardcore French incompetence and mud weather effects. But the fact remains, a solid line of troops firing disciplined, continuous, accurate volleys have, for a very long time, been able to break massed infantry charges. However, that's the thing. Massed, organized, and disciplined volleys. Very few of these things are actually going to be happening when a wall of big, angry, screaming men are running at you with sharp objects. Now, the second one, of course, is then circumstance. The obvious fact that melee has a psychological effect upon the enemy that decreases their fighting potential while increasing the fighting potential of the charging party by hyping up his aggression, etc. I think that's a pretty clear and obvious point that I don't think anyone would argue against it, so I'm just going to leave it at that. So, then there's circumstance. A lot of times, you just don't have a choice, okay? Urban combat. You often don't have a choice. You can be extremely careful, you can throw a grenade into every room, you can enter it with guns blazing, etc. But even then, you do risk getting into close-quarter combats quite often. And then there's stuff that are even worse. You gotta remember, in the 41st millennium, there's a lot of naval combat, and a key part of naval combat is boarding actions, simply because it's a hell of a lot easier to knock out a giant-ass battleship by attacking it with troops, breaching its outer defenses, going for its engines, and blowing it up or crippling it, than it is to kill it with main battery fire, as the shields of many of these ships, are quite considerable. As such, it's often just simply easier, but again, now you're fighting in extremely confined areas, and, of course, these areas are set up to favour their defender. In fact, some Imperial battleship have a wonderful little design element that connects the bridge to the rest of the ship, and in this case, the forward weapons batteries, etc., by two long corridors with practically nothing in between. There's just two long corridors, and those are the only access ways from the rear of the ships, where the engines and the bridge is, to the front of the ship, where the ammunition is, etc. What this means is that the crew can abandon one section of the ship and retreat behind the second section, where they'll be able to hold out against the enemy. Worst case scenario, the enemy takes over the bridge and the engine, and if they so choose, they can blow up the ship. But, of course, this is not something a lot of races actually do, because it kills the dudes as well. In fact, this design was primarily designed to fight against orcs, simply because orcs know what happens when they blow up a generator, and even orcs aren't that crazy. As such, in many cases, the crews simply abandoned one part of the ship and then kept onto either the weapons, thereby allowing the ship to be surrounded by friendly ships and reinforcements brought over and then finally clean out the orcs, or keeping control over the engines and the bridge, in which case they can just cut off power to the weapons, and again, they simply wait for support. And this is another one where Space Marines and specialized melee troops are fantastically effective because narrow as corridors. In many cases, the only way you're going to get through a choke point is by lowering your head and charging. Not something that is going to be all too helpful for your standard Imperial Guardsman, but a Space Marine, well, he's pretty damn used to exactly that strategy. Of course, in close-quarter combat, there's also a wide variety of things he can do to make sure he gets into melee range. For example, a frag grenade is of relatively little threat to a Space Marine. As such, even if the troops were to frag grenade the room he is in, that doesn't necessarily hurt him all that much. The same with orcs. A basic frag grenades might kill an orc, definitely, but it might not. And the Eldar have also developed a wonderful little tactic when it comes to close-quarter urban fighting. You see, the sneaky little bastards have made several uses of their cloaking technology. This has been described in... I've only seen it in one book, so canon or not canon, you decide. But essentially, they set up fake rooms where they went like, okay, there's only one room here. So the Imperial Guardsman would peek around the corner, and as this is an empty room, maybe he takes a few shots, back out, okay, just to be safe, I'll throw in a grenade. But the thing is, there were two rooms in there. All of the Eldar were hiding in the other room, which he couldn't see. So when the grenade goes off, the Imperial Guardsmen come in, and they relax, at which point they're ambushed by Eldar close combat specialists, and promptly cut into tiny screaming pieces. And lastly, of course, we've also got to consider situations where they are forced into close combat environment. There's a wonderful little book in the Imperial Armor series that is called The Siege of Vrax. I've mentioned this earlier. Vrax was a ridiculously heavily fortified world that fell to chaos from internal politics, essentially. So chaos didn't attack the planet, it just kind of turned. This necessitated an assault on the planet because it was one of the most important areas of military goods in the segmentum sector, which meant they had to be retaken, and the only way to retake a place that has been fortified for the last 100-odd years is by throwing men at it until it breaks. Imperial Space Marines are simply too valuable, in most cases, to be dedicated to a conflict of attrition like this. Imperial Space Marines are shock tools, they are scalpels, precision weapons, employed where they can help out the most, and throwing themselves against enemy fortifications for the best part of 10 years is just not their thing. It did change, though. The Space Marines were in fact employed at the Siege of Vrax, but only much later, at which point they had a fairly considerable advantage over many of their erstwhile opponents. But, of course, as is so often the case, this was also countered by Chaos Space Marines. In fact, I do believe the Chaos Space Marines were the first to arrive. I haven't read the book in a while, but I think so. So, with these extra factors, as well with psychology and circumstance, adding to the fact that melee weapons simply have in many cases an easier time defeating body armor, and the fact that so many factions and races within the 41st millennium have dedicated themselves to a more or less melee-centric style, and in the case of the Tyranids simply evolved to this style, I have no doubt that the Tyranids could have involved far more biological ranged weapons, but partially because of, game balance stuff, they haven't, and partially I think it's simply the fact that if you're a race that can produce a near infinite number of small scary monsters, it's simply a hell of a lot easier and more resource effective to use them in a psychological warfare kind of way, scaring the opponents, making them waste ammunition, screwing up with their aim, and then trying to get into melee where the scything claws, the little gaunts, etc., are quite horrifyingly effective. And, of course, other races have developed melee as a part of a combined arms approach, like the Eldars. Some races have developed melee because they're stupid, like the Orcs, and some races, like the Tau, have developed melee as an absolute last resort, please don't hit me in the face kind of way. And the Imperium, well, Imperial Space Marines simply have an advantage in melee, which is why they seek it out. Imperial Guardsmen, well, they would prefer to avoid up and close melee confrontations simply because the main advantages of the Imperial Guard, well, partially it's numbers, but by far the greatest advantage is firepower. An Imperial Guard regiment that can completely annihilate an enemy force via superior firepower is a happy regiment. One that has to grind the enemy to death over years and years of trench fighting with bayonets and shovels, not so happy an Imperial Guard regiment. So, until next time, I have been Arch, thank you very much for listening, and I hope to see you soon. Have a good day.